Welcome to Life Stories. Imagine being told you're too dumb to be a writer, that your dreams are beyond your reach. Now, imagine proving that very person wrong in the most spectacular way possible. 11 years ago, Emily Carter was humiliated by her professor, Dr. Richard Lawson, who crushed her confidence and dismissed her talent. But against all odds, she never gave up. Now, as a best-selling author and keynote speaker, she faces him once again, only this time, the power has shifted. Join us as we dive into a story of resilience, redemption, and reclaiming one's narrative. Subscribe now to begin today's story with Life Stories. The chatter of the New York City Literary Festival buzzed around me as I adjusted the festival pass hanging from my neck. The grand atrium of the convention center shimmered with warm golden light. A space filled with authors, publishers, critics, and book lovers, people who belonged. I had dreamed of this moment, of standing among the literary elite. Not as an outsider peering through the glass but as someone who had earned her place. I was no longer a struggling writer, hunched over a second-hand laptop in a tiny apartment, praying that one more revision would be the breakthrough. I was Emily Carter, the author of The Midnight Shore, a New York Times best-selling novel. And tonight, I was the festival's keynote speaker. But for all my successes, for all the hard-earned triumphs, the past still had a way of slipping through the cracks. And it came in the form of Dr. Richard Lawson, the man who had once convinced me I would never be here. I didn't see him at first. The atrium was too crowded, and my mind was elsewhere, on my speech, on the sound check, on the overwhelming sense that this night would change something deep inside me. But then, I heard his voice, cutting through the noise like a sharp edge. Events like these are for actual authors, not stupid amateurs. I froze. I turned, and there he was. The same wire-rimmed glasses. The same rigid posture. The same dismissive smirk that had haunted my college years. Dr. Richard Lawson, once my professor at the prestigious Columbia University, still carried himself with the unshakable confidence of a man who believed his judgment was absolute. He looked me over with thinly veiled contempt, his gaze lingering on my festival pass. "Shouldn't you be working on improving your grammar somewhere instead of pretending to belong here?" he said. His voice low enough to be cruel but loud enough for a few nearby attendees to hear. Heat crawled up my neck, the familiar sting of humiliation washing over me like a tidal wave. I had spent 11 years trying to prove him wrong, to silence the echo of his dismissive words that had lodged themselves deep in my bones. And yet, in an instant, I felt small again, like the 20-year-old student sitting in his classroom, listening as he eviscerated my work in front of my peers. But I wasn't that girl anymore. "I have every right to be here," I said, my voice steadier than I expected, though it still came out softer than I wanted. Lawson scoffed, adjusting his glasses. "Just because you bought a ticket doesn't mean you belong among literary professionals," he said. "Some people simply lack the intellectual capacity for serious writing, as I believe I made clear to you in college." A few festival guests turned to watch, their eyes flicking between us with curiosity. I could feel the weight of their attention, the way they were gauging the confrontation like spectators at a slow-moving accident. For a fleeting moment, I wanted to shrink away, to let it pass, to pretend his words didn't still have the power to strike at something fragile inside me. But then, I remembered why I was here. I wasn't an anonymous student anymore. I wasn't a rejected manuscript gathering dust in a drawer. I was a writer, and the irony of standing here, at the very same festival as him, wasn't lost on me. I opened my mouth to respond. But before I could, a voice cut through the tension. "There you are, Emily. I've been looking everywhere for you." It was Amanda Reynolds, the festival's executive director, striding toward us with the confidence of someone who commanded the entire room. My heart pounded as I watched Lawson's expression shift. For the first time, uncertainty flickered in his eyes. "The production team needs you for a sound check," Amanda continued, placing a gentle but firm hand on my arm. "And the photographer from the New York Times is waiting. We really should get you backstage before the crowd realizes you're out here." Silence hung thick in the air. I turned just in time to see Lawson's face drain of color. I'm sorry. Is there some confusion? He asked, forcing a tight smile. This is a former student of mine. Certainly not someone who needs a sound check. Amanda blinked, momentarily puzzled, before realization dawned on her. Oh, she said with a bright, almost amused expression. Dr. Lawson, right? I believe you're scheduled for the academic panel tomorrow. Then she turned back to me with a warm smile. Emily Carter is our keynote speaker, she said, loud enough for the nearby guests to hear. Her novel has been on the New York Times bestseller list for 28 weeks now. We're absolutely thrilled to have her headline the festival this year. The words hit the room like a shifting tide. Lawson stared at me, his mouth opening slightly, as if he had something to say but couldn't find the words. The festival guests, who had been watching our exchange, were now murmuring amongst themselves, a new understanding passing between them. You're the Emily Carter? Lawson finally managed, his voice suddenly stripped of its earlier arrogance. For years, I had imagined this moment. I had dreamed of standing before him, victorious, watching him realize just how wrong he had been. But now that it was happening, I felt something unexpected, hollow. His opinion, which had dictated so much of my self-worth for years, suddenly seemed small, insignificant against the weight of what I had built. I met his gaze, steady and unshaken. Yes, Dr. Lawson, I said quietly, the same student you once said was too stupid to write a shopping list, let alone a novel. He blinked rapidly, still processing the blow. If you'll excuse me, I continued, turning toward Amanda. It seems I have a keynote address to prepare. As we walked away, I glanced over my shoulder just once. Lawson was still standing there, frozen in place, his expression a mix of shock and dawning realization. For 11 years, I had carried his voice in my head, the weight of his words pressing down on me. But now, for the first time, I felt light, and as I stepped into the backstage area, a quiet truth settled inside me. This wasn't the end of my battle with Dr. Richard Lawson. It was only the beginning. The festival's backstage area hummed with quiet urgency. Technicians moved swiftly, adjusting microphones, testing sound levels, and ensuring everything was in place for my keynote address. But despite the whirlwind of preparations, my mind remained fixated on Dr. Richard Lawson's face. That moment of dawning realization when Amanda had shattered his perception of me. I should have felt triumphant. I had proven him wrong. Yet, an unsettling weight lingered in my chest. Something unfinished. Emily. I turned to see Jessica Coleman, an author I deeply admired. She was elegant in a way that seemed effortless, with keen eyes that missed nothing. I saw what happened out there, she said, folding her arms. Lawson looked like he'd swallowed his own foot. I let out a small laugh, though it didn't quite reach my eyes. Yeah, well, I wasn't expecting to run into him. Jessica studied me for a moment before lowering her voice. You do know he's already spinning a different version of events, right? I frowned. What do you mean? She sighed, taking a step closer. Lawson has a history of attaching himself to successful former students. He's telling people he mentored you. A slow, burning anger crept through my veins. Jessica continued. I overheard him speaking with an editor from The Atlantic. Said he recognized your potential early and helped guide you toward success. She scoffed. He did the same thing with James Harlow last year. Claimed he had been his champion when in reality, he nearly destroyed the guy's confidence. I clenched my jaw. The audacity of it. Lawson had spent an entire semester tearing me down, humiliating me in front of my classmates, and leaving me convinced I would never be a writer. And now that I had proven him wrong, he had the gall to rewrite history, to claim credit for my work? No, not this time. Thanks for telling me, I said, my voice steady but cold. Jessica nodded. Be careful, Emily. He's smart, and he knows how to play the long game. As she walked away, I felt a rush of frustration, but also something else, determination. I needed to stop him before his revisionist history became the accepted truth. Just then, Daniel Foster, My former mentor from the publishing house appeared at my side. His expression was calm but serious. "I heard about Lawson," he said. I exhaled sharply. "He's trying to claim he guided my career." "That he?" Daniel held up a hand. "I know. And I also know you still have his old critiques from college." My breath caught. The portfolio. I had saved every single paper. Every harsh critique scrawled in red ink. Every note where he dismissed me as hopelessly amateurish. "You have something he doesn't," Daniel said. "Evidence." For the first time that night, I felt the weight of power shift in my favor. It was time for the truth to come out. The main hall of the New York City Literary Festival was packed. Nearly 1,000 attendees filled the space, their murmurs blending into a low hum of anticipation. I stood backstage, my heart pounding, my fingers tightening around the pages of my speech. Dr. Richard Lawson was somewhere in that crowd. He would be sitting among literary critics, editors, and publishers, the same people he had tried to deceive. And I was about to rewrite the story he was trying to steal from me. A deep breath. The stage manager gave me a nod. It was time. I stepped onto the stage, the bright overhead lights momentarily blinding me. The applause was thunderous, but it barely registered. My eyes scanned the crowd, searching, until I found him. Lawson sat in the third row, looking composed but watchful. Beside him was William Everett, the film producer interested in adapting my novel. Several well-known critics sat nearby, listening intently. I forced a steady breath. "Thank you for that kind introduction," I began, my voice clear, unwavering. "Tonight, I want to talk about the journey that brought me here. The full, unvarnished truth of it." A hush fell over the room. Behind me, the screen flickered. The first slide appeared. A scanned copy of one of my old college assignments. Covered in red ink, the audience squinted, leaning in to read the brutal comments. "Success like this doesn't happen in isolation," I continued. "It takes mentors, supporters, and sometimes, obstacles that force you to develop resilience." Click. The next slide. More scathing remarks in Lawson's handwriting. "Hopelessly amateurish. No grasp of structure. Perhaps consider a less intellectual pursuit." The tension in the room thickened. I didn't need to look at Lawson to know he had gone rigid in his seat. "This was my final assignment in creative writing 301, I said, pausing for effect, along with my professor's assessment that I was, and I quote, "too intellectually limited to ever succeed as a writer." A murmur rippled through the crowd. From the corner of my eye, I saw William Everett shift uncomfortably, leaning away from Lawson. I clicked through several more examples of his critiques. The final slide appeared. His end-of-course evaluation. D student. Lacks fundamental talent. Would be better served pursuing a career that doesn't require intellectual depth. Silence. I let it linger before speaking again. Yesterday, this same professor approached me at this festival, offering to include me in his book about students he had mentored to success. I looked directly at Lawson for the first time. He has been telling people here that he recognized my talent early and guided my development. Gasps. Stiffened postures. I took a steady breath. But that's not the truth. And for the next 10 minutes, I told them what was. The standing ovation felt surreal. The applause wasn't just for my book, my keynote, or even my success. It was for the truth finally being heard. I stepped off the stage, my hands still trembling, but not from nerves, from release, from closure. Across the room, I caught sight of Dr. Richard Lawson, still seated, his face pale, his carefully constructed narrative shattered in front of the entire literary world. No more lies, no more stolen credit. He was just a man who had underestimated the wrong student. As I made my way toward the book signing area, people approached me, writers, aspiring authors, even established literary figures, all sharing their own experiences of rejection, of being told they weren't good enough. One woman gripped my hand. "I had a professor like that," she whispered. "I almost gave up. Thank you for this." I nodded, squeezing her hand. This was bigger than just me and Lawson. It was about all the voices that had been silenced. Later that evening, as I sat in the festival's VIP lounge, Amanda Reynolds approached with a quiet smile. The board had a meeting. She said, "Lawson won't be invited back next year." I exhaled slowly, the weight of the past finally lifting from my shoulders. At the very end of the night, Lawson himself appeared, his posture hesitant. "I owe you an apology," he said. I studied him for a moment, then handed him a signed copy of my book. To Dr. Lawson, who reminded me that critics are just readers with opinions. "Thank you for the motivation." I turned away before he could respond. Because, finally, his opinion no longer mattered. And that, in the end, was the real victory.